So this is behind the scenes video of the sort that I'm going to start making for all my future podcast episodes on Villains and Virgins. And basically, I'll be putting them on Patreon, and they'll be exclusive to people that are following and that are trying to support the podcast. Because while we do most of this in-house, it does take time and it does take money to produce. So for those people that are going the extra mile and supporting it, I want them to have access to something more. When I got into the Peasants' Rebellion, it had been this peripheral thing. I was extremely familiar with the Reformation and Martin Luther and his ideas and their significance and all that. But I kept hearing about the Peasants' War sort of in the margins. It would keep popping up whenever I was reading about Martin Luther and what he said. And I knew that the Peasants' War had happened and that Martin Luther had rejected it. But I really didn't know, what it was about, what the argument was that the peasants were making. And it seemed pretty significant. Like the number of times it popped up in my research, not just in years past, but as I was going over the material in the last few months doing the Reformation series, I thought, I really need to dig into this. And I'm so glad I did, because I think it's a fascinating story. And I think one of the most significant things about it is how different things might have looked if the peasants had won. If this war had resulted in a renegotiation of sort of what economic obligations they had to their landlords, how would that have affected what came next, which were things like the 30 Years' War and the economic devastation that came out of that? It's really hard to predict and understand all the different ways that would have shaken out if this particular moment had gone differently. But that's one of the interesting things, because it really was a total challenge to the way everything was organized. And it's a challenge that was crushed, but what if it hadn't been, What would it have looked like? And the other thing about it that really fascinates me is the fact that the peasants are quoting the Bible, that they see themselves sincerely as applying Reformation ideas and taking them on the road, you know, that they really believe in this stuff. This is not just a lip service thing. I mean, demand number one is that they can have their own Reform pastor in their communities, not have the Catholic Church send them a priest who's connected to that hierarchy and that tradition. And so if this is number one, they see themselves as Reformed at heart. This is a very important thing to them. If this is number one on their list of 12 demands, and they're going to be risking life and limb in support of trying to make this a reality, for this to be the first one, that's not a side note. That's not a lip service or a political thing. And so for them to be sincerely believing that what they're doing is it directly in line with how they understand Christianity is fascinating to me. The more so because Martin Luther absolutely rejects them. And so I think this is a really interesting moment, not just because of the division in how reformers are understanding what the Protestant Reformation means, but also because it symbolizes so many other similar moments. Whether you're looking at slavery and abolition in the States, whether you're looking at Christians in Nazi Germany, some of whom said we have to obey the authorities, and some of them who said, hell no. You have people who are part of the same religious community with the same religious text who are using that text to justify completely opposite sets of actions. And that to me is one of the most interesting parts of this story. I've also posted on Patreon a list of sources that I used to make this miniseries, and you can find that. It's not an exhaustive list. It would be tedious to put every single source that I've looked at, but I put the ones that are the most useful, the ones that I got larger or more reliable amounts of information from that I think are really important. So if you're interested in digging into it yourself and tracking down some of the details I didn't have time to cover, you can definitely go searching for that. When I make these miniseries episodes, it typically takes several weeks, sometimes months of reading. There'll be a trip to the library, there'll be a stack of books, there'll be a whole lot of reading of scholarly journal articles that I'm tracking down through university online access libraries. And then they'll be crawling around on the web for other articles, which I have to be very careful in selecting because not all of those ones are as reliable. So there's a huge amount of information gathering and sifting and sorting and organizing that goes on behind making one of these. But I will try to provide a list of some sources that I think are useful and accessible going forward. And I'll put those on Patreon as well so that you can dig in and do some of your own homework if you are so inclined. I've been reading the comments on my YouTube videos on the Reformation series, but particularly on episode 1 of the Peasants' War, which has just recently been released. And one of the things that keeps coming up is people saying, I had no idea about this. I had no idea this had happened, or that it was so important, or that Martin Luther responded the way that he did. And so I think that that's a really interesting indication of just how little is known about the period in general and about sort of the less glorious moments of some of our favorite reformers. I think the fact that the Peasants' War concludes with Martin Luther agreeing with the Pope on something for once after 1517 is a really shocking moment, and it's a really telling moment. And I think it must have been seen as utter betrayal by peasants who had taken him at his word and who had taken these words to be the manifesto that they were going to risk life and limb for. And I think it's a very, very sad conclusion to what must have been a moment of hope for people who otherwise had had very little. Thank you so much for those of you who are on Patreon actively supporting what I do and making it possible for me to do more. And if you've been enjoying the episodes and you're not already on Patreon, please consider heading over there. Not just because it helps me do what I do, but it's also a place where I look for questions or comments or ideas about what I should do next. So I really look forward to the conversations that happen over there as well.